Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining for our next IX seminar series. Thank you also for all of those who've joined via live streaming. We are very excited today to have Professor Rafal Bogacz, and hopefully I'm saying your name correctly, for his talk called Mechanisms of Deep Learning in the Brain. And he's coming from Oxford today, so please give him a huge round of applause.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but we will be using the microphone for any questions asked today. So if you do want to ask a question, are you okay with questions during the talk?
I'm okay.
Then just raise your hand and we'll get you a microphone, either me or Ellie. Okay. Thank you.
So thank you, Nicole, for a kind introduction and invitation. So it's really great to be here and see our beautiful new modern campus. The research in my group is trying to understand the mechanisms of learning in large and deep networks of the brain. And the work I will present today was led by talented postdoctoral researcher Yu-Hang Song. To understand learning in the brain, it's actually useful to compare it with learning in artificial neural networks, because we know that thanks to the success of deep learning, the neural networks are able to learn very effectively, the artificial one, and we actually understand how they work because we designed them. And as most of you probably know, artificial neural networks are trained with an algorithm called backpropagation, which modifies the parameters describing the connection strengths between the artificial neurons in order to minimize the error made by the network on the output. There are some kind of similarities between the learning in artificial neural network and in the brain. The parameters are stored in the connections between the neurons. The computation is made by simple elements, but there are also many, many differences. And you can kind of list all these differences. For example, biological neurons are not continuous. They produce this kind of brief impulses of spikes. Biological neurons can either have positive weights or negative weights, but a single neuron cannot have both. So there are all these kind of like small detailed differences. Nevertheless, it's possible to adapt learning algorithms to take into consideration these differences. However, there's one constraint on the computation in the brain which is kind of fundamental, and it's, I think, most difficult to understand. And this is the constraint of local computation and plasticity. And in particular, biological neurons have to work autonomously, and they have to make their computation only on the basis of the inputs they receive. And the synapses, which store the synaptic weights, can update their weight only on the activity of the two neurons they connect. There are no any kind of external signals which can tell the synapse how much the weight should be modified, which is computed by some kind of external algorithm. It has to be all done autonomously. So there's this kind of big challenge of how we can achieve learning which is as effective or even better than this in artificial neural networks with the constraint of local computation. And I think that this is the kind of the most fundamental constraint of biological networks. And I personally feel that it's worth investigating it first, because once we understand this will kind of will identify the fundamental principles of learning in the brain, and then the other constraint can be easily satisfied. So does the brain make computation similar to backpropagation algorithm? So much work, including from our group, has investigated in the past how you can approximate backpropagation with local computation and local plasticity, and several interesting proposals have been made. However, we also know that learning in the brain is superior to backpropagation in some aspects. So, for example, we require much less data to train ourselves, and we can do our training with many fewer iterations than artificial systems. And also, in artificial neural networks, there's a problem of interference between various tasks which you learn. So we somehow are able to learn with much smaller interference. So because the kind of some superior abilities of biological learning, there's this question whether we should really focus as a field on trying to understand how the brain implements backpropagation. And I would try to argue in this talk that the answer to this question is no. Because in fact, the brain, in my opinion, doesn't do backpropagation, but does something fundamentally different, which we call prospective configuration. So I will first explain what is prospective configuration, and then I will try to give you some intuition of how it arises from some kind of simple models of neurons performing local computations. And then I will try to argue that this principle of prospective configuration has actually advantages over backpropagation in tasks which are similar to the tasks which animals or humans face in natural environment. And as Nicole mentioned, if you have any questions during the talk, feel free to interrupt or pose any questions or comments. So what is prospective configuration? How does it differ from backpropagation? So as most of you know, in backpropagation, we modify the weight of the connection to reduce the error on the output. Now, in prospective configuration, you also modify the weights. However, before you do it, you first adjust the activity of all the neurons in the hidden layer to an optimal configuration in which the output is correctly predicted, and each neuron is kind of similar to its input. And then once you've optimized the activity of all the hidden units and find the right configuration, only then you modify the weights to reinforce this pattern of activity in the network. And this prospective configuration is not a new algorithm which we invented. It's actually a feature of many models of information processing in the cortex. And these are models which belong to the family of energy-based models, which reduce a function called energy during learning and inference. And I will give you some kind of intuition what this energy is in a moment. And this energy describes some kind of constraints which the network should satisfy. And examples of such energy-based models include Hopfield networks and also predictive coding networks. So predictive coding networks are closely associated with the City of London because they have been extended and popularized by Carl Friston from University College London. So maybe you might have heard about them. Has anyone heard about predictive coding networks? Yes, great. Okay, so I will try to argue that this mechanism of prospective configuration, which is present in predictive coding network, actually reduces interference in comparison to backpropagation. So it's able to learn new information while preserving information present already in the network. And I will try to show you an example in a moment which illustrates that by first inferring this desired pattern of activity of hidden units, the network can kind of foresee errors that may be introduced by weight modification and immediately correct them. So this I will demonstrate it with a simple example. So we try to come up, before showing you the details of the models, I wanted to give you intuition, and we try to come up with a simple example illustrating this principle of prospective configuration and its advantages. And in this example, the brain has to make prediction on the basis of input in one modality about activity in other modalities. So imagine that there is a bear which hunts for salmon in this river. So imagine that the bear comes there regularly. So whenever the bear will see the river, its brain will generate a prediction of smell of salmon and sound of the water. But imagine that on a particular day, a bear has an injured ear. Maybe it had a fight with another bear and doesn't hear the sound. So the brain of the bear needs to adapt and needs to learn that there will be no sound for some time. And because initially you will have an error in the auditory cortex. So backpropagation can, of course, solve this problem. So what backpropagation will do will kind of propagate this error from the auditory cortex throughout the network. And a kind of key feature of backpropagation is that while you propagate the error, you do not change the activity of the neuron. So in a moment, I will show the activity of the neuron with colors. And while you propagate the errors, you don't change the activity of the neurons. And then what backpropagation will do will reduce the weights on the pathway from the visual input to the auditory cortex. And indeed, on the next trial, the bear will make a smaller prediction of the sound of the water. However, please note that by reducing these weights, backpropagation will also reduce the prediction of the smell of the salmon, right? Because it will reduce these weights. So on the next trial, the bear may not smell the salmon and may even not hunt and go hungry, which we don't want. It's kind of like a very striking example of interference because this output was correctly predicted on the previous trial. And even if it was correctly predicted, modification of the weights to correct some other output changed the weights such that now the smell is not correctly predicted. So now what happens in prospective configuration is that you present the inputs to different modalities, and then the activity of hidden neuron changes. And in particular, for this particular outputs, the hidden neurons will decrease their activity. But now, if this neuron has a lower activity, then there is a prediction error also for this neuron. So this neuron is active because the smell is present, but this neuron has reduced activity, so there is a positive prediction error. And because of this, predictive coding networks, or the networks employing prospective configuration, would not only reduce the weights here, but would immediately compensate and increase this weight. So within a single trial, they kind of can predict the kind of side effect of this learning and immediately compensate for it, and will reduce the interference, and now our happy bear can still hunt for salmon. Okay, so now this may sound like a very mysterious phenomenon. How can we build networks which have this property? So actually, this is the property of predictive coding networks. And predictive coding networks may seem difficult to understand because they are usually described by a set of differential equations, which may be kind of complicated to get intuition for. But Yuhang came up with this really easy way to explain how predictive coding networks work. So he came up with this mechanical analogy, which is a machine, abstract machine made of rods and balls, which makes exactly the same computation as predictive coding networks, has exactly the same dynamics, but it's very easy to understand. So let me first use this machine analog to explain how this predictive coding network works, and then I will kind of show you how it maps on biology. So in this, let's kind of consider a very simple neural network where we have just 3 neurons connected linearly. So in this mechanical analogy, activity of a neuron corresponds to a height of a ball sliding on a vertical post. So for example, here we have this neuron has little activity, this has medium level of activity, and this is highly active neuron. Now the connections between the neurons corresponds to rods pointing to another input node, which can also slide here, and the height of this input is equal to the activity of presynaptic neuron times the weight. So in this particular example, all the weights are equal to 1, so all these bars are horizontal. And the key feature of predictive coding networks is that the activity of a neuron is not fixed to its inputs, as in artificial neural networks, but you can think about it as being connected by a spring. And spring tries to kind of compress, so its natural state is a compressed state, so it tries to kind of reduce its potential energy. Okay, and the dynamics of the network is driven by reduction of the potential elastic energy of all the springs, which in this particular model, or in this analogy, is fully equivalent to the free energy, which you may hear Carl Friston mention. For example, when you try to use this network for prediction, you would constrain one of the nodes, which is represented here by a pin, and let the network relax. So if you just constrain one end of the network can reduce its energy fully. So all the springs can collapse, and you end up with this state. And note already you can see here that predictive coding network makes exactly the same prediction as artificial neural network with corresponding weights. Yes? So here the weights are equal to 1, and if you had an artificial neural network with the same weights, you would get exactly the same prediction. And it's a kind of property of this predictive coding networks that if you use them for predictions, they make exactly the same prediction as artificial neural network with the same weights. Now, during training, you would constrain both input and output of this network to an input and target pattern. And now, when you let the network relax, the energy will reduce, but it cannot be reduced to 0. So it will kind of, the hidden node will kind of converge to some state of low energy. And then, once you cannot reduce the energy by changing the activity anymore, then the model reduces the energy by changing the weight. So basically, you will now tune the angle of this rod. So I think that this machine is so intuitive that I actually built it from Lego, from my son's Lego. And if you want, you can play with it after the talk. And I tried to make a video of this machine, but then my 11-year-old son looked at me and had some mercy for me, and he made a video for me. So let me show you. Yes. So basically, this is in this machine. This is a neuron sliding on a post. This is the input to this neuron, which is also sliding on the post. And instead of spring, I used rubber bands, which also have, which are attached between the two, so that the kind of natural state is when they are aligned. So now, what happens during prediction is that you just constrain one end of this machine, and the network is making prediction. And you can see that in this example, the weights are equal to 1, so the output is the same as input. Now, during training, you might have seen that initially this node went up, so the rubber bands were extended, and then the angle of these nodes has changed, so the weights have been modified. And now, when on the next trial the network is making a prediction, you can see that it's kind of higher, it's closer to the target. And then you can now look at this again and enjoy the whole video and various additional elements like moving pins made by my son for no reason. Okay. Great. So how does it relate? How this energy machine relates to kind of biological implementation? So it turns out that actually there is a very simple architecture of a neural network which has exactly the same dynamics as this machine. And this network includes two types of neurons. So there are the value neurons, which are shown in blue, which corresponds to this normal neurons in artificial neural networks, or the nodes. And there are error neurons, which correspond to springs. And they are connected in this pattern. It's very easy to understand this pattern if you just kind of understand, what is the function of this element. So the error, or the spring, is extension of the spring is equal to the difference between the activity of the corresponding neuron and input from the previous layer. So basically, the error neuron will get excitation from its corresponding neuron and inhibition from the neuron from the previous layer. Now, in the machine, the nodes are moved by the springs. And in fact, this node is actually moved both by this spring and this spring. So this spring will pull it down, and this spring will pull it up. So in this architecture, again, the value nodes will get excitation from here and inhibition from here. And the weights are encoded in weights of the connections. And it's slightly less intuitive, but I will show you now in a moment that actually modification of these weights corresponds to something which is called Hebbian plasticity. So the weight change is just proportional to the product of activity of presynaptic and postsynaptic neurons. So I would like to now go through mathematical details of this model. So this part is not essential for understanding of the rest of the talk. So if you don't want to hear about this, you can think about something nice, and I will tell you when to finish. But for those who are interested, I wanted to kind of go through the details of how this model is described mathematically. So I will denote the activity of neurons in different layers by X with a superscript corresponding to the layer, and the weights by W, again with a superscript corresponding to the kind of layer of origin. Now, the extension of the spring, or the error, will be noted by epsilon. So again, with a subscript corresponding to the, superscript corresponding to the layer. So the error in layer L is equal to the difference between the corresponding activity and the input from the previous layer. Now, I will provide you a description of this model for this very simple machine, because it's kind of easy to do without too much complicated notation, but this kind of can generalize to much larger, to arbitrarily large and deep networks. So here we have just two springs in this machine, so we have two errors. So the energy could be just defined as the sum of these two errors squared, because elastic energy scales with a square of the spring extension. So during inference, the dynamics of the network changes such that activity of the nodes minimizes the energy. So the activity changes with the gradient of energy, with negative gradient of energy. And then once the network converges to an equilibrium, the weights are modified, again, in the direction opposite to the gradient of energy. So in this simple network, if we have just one hidden node during training, there's just one variable which can change. That's why I put x2 here, the hidden neuron. So now, for this super simple system, it's easy to evaluate these gradients, and you end up with very simple expressions. So let me remind you, the activity of the neuron changes with the gradient of energy over this activity. So you can see that the activity of neuron 2 appears in both of these errors. So for this error, it will appear in this term. For this error, it will appear in this term. So if you now evaluate this gradient, you end up with two terms. And the first term will be just using the chain rule corresponding to the error times 1. And the other will be the error times minus w. Now, to modify the weights, you modify the weights in the direction opposite to the gradient of energy over weight, and each weight only appears in one corresponding energy term. So weight WL appears in the energy term epsilon L plus 1. So the gradient will be just epsilon L plus 1 times the gradient of this expression, which is just XL. And so these are the very simple rules which you get for updates of activity and updates of weights. And now, if you look at these three equations, you can essentially see that this network really realizes the computations described by these equations. So, so in particular, for the error neurons, the right-hand side of the equation corresponds to the input this error neurons get, right? So this neuron gets input from x3, which is this term, and inhibition from W2, X2, which is this connection. By contrast, the value node, X2, will now be driven. So this is a differential equation. So it's a derivative over time. And it's driven by the two error nodes. So it receives inhibition from corresponding error node and excitation from the other error node via connections with weights W. And now the most beautiful aspect of this model is that the weight modification just corresponds to the product of the error and value nodes. And if you look at the network, these are the two nodes which these weights connect. So the weight change just corresponds to the product of activity of the two neurons the weights connect. So basically, all these computations in this network is fully local. Does anyone have any question at this point? Yes?
Yeah, okay. Thank you. I'm just wondering about the trivial solution for this energy minimization problem. It seems to me that if W is equal to 1, right, then you have an error of, so if you want to aim for an error of 0, right, the epsilon is equal to 0 and W is equal to 1, then you're going to have like the identity map. Like, what is a trivial solution to this problem? Because
so it
just looking at that equation, thank you.
There's no trivial solution, because please note that x1 and x3 can be arbitrary, right? So depending on what x1 and x3 are, this will dictate what w's minimize the error. So for example, if x1 is equal to x3, you are absolutely right that error will be minimized by w1 and w2 equal to each other. But if, for example, x1 is 1 and x3 is 2, so you have the situation, when one of the nodes is higher, then you cannot minimize the error by setting w's to equal to 1. So if you constrain both ends of this network, there's kind of no trivial solution. You have to really modify the weights to kind of minimize the error. Yes. So epsilon are defined. So this is the so this is the kind of definition, right? And what happens during so basically you can think about it that epsilon is part of the definition of the energy function. Yes. And what happens is that while this network is, for example, learning, we'll first optimize activity of all the nodes in the hidden layers using this equation. So by minimizing the energy, and once the energy is minimized, then you change the weight to minimize the energy. Sorry? Yes. Well, so for a given training pattern, you first optimize this until convergence. So you run this equation until convergence. So you let the network relax to equilibrium, and then you modify the weights once. And this is the kind of one iteration of learning for this network. Yes? Great. Yeah. Thank you for yeah. Any other questions? Okay. So I so far demonstrated only like a very trivial problem. So now let's see what else this network can do. So before going to like real-world problems, let's look at the salmon problem, which I used to motivate the issue. So now this is now the energy machine corresponding to the salmon problem. So we have the visual cortex, the auditory cortex, and the olfactory cortex here. And there's some kind of hidden neuron in, I don't know, some associative cortex. Let me remind you that a bear sees the river, smells the salmon, but doesn't hear it, doesn't hear the river. So there's a negative prediction error here, with the spring is extended. And let's see how this network behaves. So if you let the network relax, then you can immediately see that this node will slide down. So you will end up with this equilibrium. And you can see that in this equilibrium, there is prediction error also here. So this spring is extended. So then when you modify the weights, you will modify the weights to kind of reduce the extension of the springs. So you will decrease these two weights, but you will also increase these weights because this spring pulls this node upwards. So on the next trial, you will reduce the prediction for the sound, but you will maintain the prediction for the smell. And this will not happen in backpropagation. Okay, so now, of course, this was just a cartoon. So you can ask, does this model really behave this way if I simulate it? So this is a simulation of this very simple network. So this is the network with these 4 neurons in the salmon problem. And what I'm plotting here, I'm plotting how the activity on the output of this network changes during learning. So on this graph, the horizontal axis corresponds to sound, and vertical axis corresponds to smell. So initially, the bear predicts both, but we want the bear to just predict the smell, but not the sound. So this is our target. This is our initial output. And what I'm showing here with crosses is how the output will change if you train this network with backpropagation. And circles show how this output changes when you train the network with predictive coding. And so you can see that first, both models are eventually able to learn the target. And this is not surprising. We know that backpropagation can learn. But critically, please note that backpropagation will make this big detour. So it will reduce the prediction for the smell as well, while this interference is much more reduced in predictive coding network. Now, what is striking here is that for this very simple problem, we can also plot the landscape of loss. Yes? So landscape of loss is plotted with these colorful lines. So loss is equal to 0 here, and please note the axes are a little bit stretched. So loss landscape will be just circles in the space of outputs. So they are kind of ellipses because the axes are stretched. And if you go with a gradient of loss in the space of outputs, this will correspond to the movement which is orthogonal to these lines. But backprop doesn't do it. And this is very kind of striking because we know that backprop is the gradient optimization, but the backprop minimizes loss and goes with a gradient of loss in the space of weights, but not in the space of outputs. So minimizing loss in the space of weights does not naturally translate to minimizing the loss in the space of outputs. So you can see that, surprisingly, backpropagation is kind of not orthogonal to the slides. Okay, so now, of course, when he presented these pictures, the reviewers asked, oh, clearly, this is just your choice of learning rate. Clearly, if you have a smaller learning rate, just backpropagation would make a much smaller detour. So we tried it, and it turns out that no, the learning rate has a very little effect on this trajectory. So even like with a tiny learning rate, so you don't see individual dots, backprop makes this huge detour, while predictive coding will kind of move much more directly towards target. Yes, and of course this is such detour is very bad for our bear or any natural situation, because you shouldn't kind of make mistakes while you are learning tasks, because it can be bad for your survival. Okay, so now we can define the kind of the measure which we call target alignment, which is the kind of how well the algorithm changes its outputs in the direction of the target. So basically, we define this target alignment as the cosine of the angle between the direction from the output before the learning towards the target and output before the learning to output after learning. Yes? So this is basically where the network should go. This is where it actually goes in the output space. And we define target alignment as a cosine of this angle. So if it's 1, we go perfectly towards the target. If it's 0, we go orthogonally. So the kind of basically high target alignment is low interference. Low target alignment is kind of high interference in learning. So now we can ask, does this finding generalize beyond the salmon problem? So does it generalize to bigger networks? So now Yuhang simulated networks with random weights. So basically these are networks with 64 neurons per layers. Weights are initialized randomly, and the number of layers is shown here. And they are just trained on a random target. So you just generate random input, random output, and train for one iteration, and calculate the target alignment. And the target alignment is shown for backprop in orange and for predictive coding in blue. And indeed, you can see that first, if you don't have any hidden layers, both backprop and predictive coding will be moving the output spot on towards the target. But as the network becomes deeper and deeper, then the target alignment decreases, because these different weight changes in different layers starts to interfere with each other. And thirdly, the backpropagation is has consistently lower target alignment than predictive coding. So the predictive coding moves you consistently much more directly towards the target than backprop. Okay, so then we thought, okay, so nice. So this should translate to some benefits of learning. So in particular, if you are moving more directly towards the target, then your learning should be faster. And since this difference is bigger and bigger for more layers, the learning in predictive coding should be kind of faster when you have deeper networks. And this is, again, what we observed. So now Yuhang trained the network on fashion MNest. And here we can see we have a network with 15 hidden layers. And basically, you can see the error on the test set as a function of the training epoch for predictive coding and backpropagation. And of course, the testing error will depend on your choice of your learning rate. So for each algorithm separately, we optimize learning rate to minimize mean of the test error across this period, because mean of the test error is a kind of measure of how quickly you are able to learn. It's a kind of measure of sampling efficiency, essentially. And basically, all the plots, which I'm showing throughout the talks, are for the optimal learning rate for a given algorithm. So you can see that even if you optimize the learning rate for backprop, it is still learning slower with more iteration than predictive coding. And now you can plot the mean of the test error as the function of the number of layers. And you see few observations. So first, this curve has a U shape, because when you have no hidden layers, the network is not unable to learn fashion MNest. Now, when you have then the kind of, it's learning better. But then if you have too many layers, then the network is super deep, and it takes time to kind of propagate information through the layers. So this mean test error, again, increases because the network learns more slowly. But importantly, the gap between predictive coding and backpropagation increases as the network gets deeper. And this is exactly what we expect from this kind of interference between these different weight updates in different layers in backprop. Okay, so now we wanted to see if this model has advantage in various kind of biologically relevant learning scenarios. So since machine learning has developed all this kind of benchmark tests, we're using benchmarks for machine learning, but we slightly twisted them to make them a little bit more similar to what biological neural network would have to experience. So first, we try to see what happens if you train neural networks without batch training. So I'm sure that you know that for artificial neural networks, you train the neural networks with batches, right? So you first provide a set of training examples. For each training example, you calculate the weight change, and then you calculate the average weight change in the batch, and then you modify the weights. And you have to do it because the individual weight changes are just so erratic because of the interference that you cannot really apply them. But of course, the brain cannot do this. We have to learn after each experience. You know, we don't want to wait for 10 interactions with a tiger to learn about tiger, right? So we have to learn without batches. And if you look at the learning without batches, indeed, there is a kind of significant, small but significant advantage of predictive coding over backprop. And also the minimum test error is lower for predictive coding. Now, the biggest difference between the algorithms occurs in tasks where there is some prior knowledge. Because, you know, in such tasks, you have to really reduce interference. You have to kind of modify some knowledge, but keep the other knowledge. And this is the kind of the task where this prospective configuration really makes a difference. So we tested problems of concept drifting. So we trained, again, these networks on fashion MNest. But every 100 trials, we shuffled 5 labels while kept another 5 labels constant. So the network had to relearn mapping of some classes, but keep the mapping of other classes. So you can see the test error of this network, and 0 corresponds to networks already pre-trained with backpropagation. So we took the same starting point for each algorithm. And then the spikes, as you can guess, are the moments where the mapping changes. And essentially, you can see that even for the optimized learning rate for each algorithm, prospective configuration can achieve smaller test error than backpropagation. And this problem, you can think about it as being equivalent to the Salmon problem, right? Because as in the Salmon problem, you have to change some outputs, but not others. And here, the difference in performance is quite large. Also, there is advantage of predictive coding when you have a limited training set, when you have continual learning problems, where you have to kind of learn multiple problems at the same time, and also in reinforcement learning problems, where we trained deep reinforcement learning networks. And I think that the advantage of predictive coding comes from the fact that in this problem, the target depends on the activity of the network itself. So any kind of fluctuation in activity of the network will be kind of magnified during learning and will make learning more difficult. So there is also a big difference in performance in this task. Okay, so now let me just kind of discuss a little bit these findings. So before we notice that predictive coding actually use different, fundamentally different principle than backpropagation, we spent a lot of time investigating what's the relationship of predictive coding to backpropagation, and can you make predictive coding equal to backpropagation? And we have a series of papers showing that, yes, you can find some exotic parameters for which predictive coding will exactly converge to backpropagation. Yes? And essentially, you can, the trick is to somehow prevent the changes of activity of hidden neurons during relaxation. So if you somehow prevent or reduce the changes in activity of hidden neurons during relaxation, these predictive coding networks converge to backpropagation. And you can do it in 2 ways. So for example, in our first paper, we showed that essentially, if you make the springs in the last output layer weaker, or my rubber bands weaker, then essentially this will result in smaller changes in activity of the hidden units in the whole network. And then in this regime, in the limit of this spring being kind of infinitely weaker than the other springs, predictive coding kind of mathematically converge to backprop. And the second way of doing this, we showed that you can maybe modify the weights in a particular moments of time. So if you just modify the weights in a particular moment of time, this error reaches a given layer before these neurons are able to update themselves, then you also get exactly backprop. Yes? However, now we realized that the fact that predictive coding networks are doing this prospective configuration rather than backprop is not a bug, it's actually a feature. And it's a key feature which allows these networks to basically avoid or reduce interference. So now this network also kind of addresses the question of the, how the brain solves the plasticity stability dilemma. So from experimental neuroscience, we know that all the time, if we perceive some new stimuli, our neurons in primary visual cortex, in the kind of first input layer of our networks, change their weights. Yes? So how is it possible that we can still see if all this representation are fluid, right? And predictive coding offers one of the answers to these questions. So it shows that when some weights are modified during learning, and kind of compensatory changes are made to other weights to maintain the correct input-output mapping. And there's also, just want to kind of highlight that there's many other papers which address the issue of reducing interference during learning. And they are approaching this from a slightly different angle. So prospective configuration reduces interference within pattern. So this is like in the salmon example. You have some information in the pattern which should be preserved and some information which should be changed. So prospective configuration reduces interference within pattern. And there's several other approaches, you might be familiar with this paper, which reduce interference between patterns. So they try to kind of ensure that if some weights are really important for one particular memory, then these weights are kind of preserved and you don't touch them. And they are complementary because they try to reduce different types of interference than prospective configuration. So I think that both of these mechanisms are likely to operate in the brain in parallel to kind of jointly reduce interference. Now, the kind of fundamental and really cool feature of predictive coding networks, or all this wider family of energy-based models, is that they work in fully autonomous way. There's no external algorithm which tries to compute weight changes and modify them. There's no algorithm which kind of routes information to the network. And they just follow the same dynamics all the time. Yes? So please note that, and the rules of dynamics are that you first update your activity, and then if you cannot reduce the energy by updating activity, then you change the weights to further reduce energy. And please note that the same rules will give you the correct behavior both during the prediction and training. So during the prediction, when you just provide the input pattern, as I showed you, with the energy machine, the errors can be reduced to 0. So the weight modification will not take place because the energy is already 0. So you have exactly the same rules which control the behavior of the network both during prediction and during training. And the only little rule which has to be satisfied that this synapses should wait with update until the network converges to equilibrium. So there should be some kind of mechanism to detect the network converges to equilibrium in the standard predictive coding networks. But we demonstrated that even this is not necessary. So if you basically modify the weights in parallel with modification of activity, the networks still work very well. Yes. And we have some kind of also theoretical explanation why this is the case. So they kind of work fully autonomously. So in summary, we propose that the cortical networks infer the desired neural activity before the plasticity. And this is the kind of fundamental mechanism of prospective configuration, which is distinct to backpropagation, which first modifies the weights. And then the changes in activity are a result of the weight modification. And this prospective configuration can be implemented in wide family of energy-based models which employ only local computation and local plasticity and enables more effective learning in contexts faced by biological organisms. So basically, I just wanted to acknowledge my group, and in particular, Yuhang, who was leading this work, and also my funding from Medical Research Council. And if you are interested, our paper is available on bioRxiv. Thank you very much.
Hi, thanks for the really interesting talk. I had two questions. One I think is quite quick. So the first one was in the energy machine model you have, the Lego model, the activations are basically continuous, right? Whereas for neurons, we'd think of them as being spiking or not. So are you interpreting essentially that it's the rate over time?
So there are various ways of, which have been proposed in the literature of making predictive coding networks spiking. My favorite model is work from Sophie Denef and Christian Mechens, and the way they think about this is that when the neuron produces spikes, the true output from the neuron are not the spikes, but are convolved spikes, because postsynaptic neurons really see, when the presynaptic neuron fires, the changes in the postsynaptic neurons are this kind of continuous convolved. So if these are spikes S, the output from such neuron is really something like this. And they have like a beautiful mathematical formula. So this is the first output is Berlin 2013, which describes like a beautiful mathematical formula of translating this kind of predictive coding networks into a spiking networks. And we have a project, in fact, with Claudia Klopat here in Imperial, collaborating on trying to scale up this kind of models.
Okay, thanks. And can I ask one more? Yeah, sure. Thanks. And then my second question was, you showed like a sort of toy architecture at some point in the talk, which had, I think, mostly feed-forward inhibition and feedback excitation. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't really clear to me then, later in the talk, when you're training the models, do you enforce that? Do you enforce those weight masks, essentially, so that feed-forward is always inhibitory and feedback is always excitatory, or not?
That's a great question. Let me just explain it. So let me go back to the network.
I guess where I wanted to go with that was just, it implies there's a lot more, you need a lot more inhibition in the network than we maybe think there is in the brain, right?
Okay, so this is a very interesting question. So let me just explain. So the way this works is that you have this parameters W. But when you train these networks, W can be either positive or negative. So basically, if W is positive, then this connection is inhibitory. If W is negative, then this connection is actually excitatory. And vice versa for this connection, right? So basically, what you do, you don't enforce the sign of W, but basically this W has negative sign here and positive sign here. So basically plug the W you have into these equations. The other thing is that indeed you have to enforce that these connections are equal to 1 and stay at 1 for the network to work. Just to mention that I agree that this is clearly not biologically plausible in terms of inhibition and excitation, but again, this is not a difficult problem to solve. So there's a very nice paper by Georg Keller, which basically showed how you can reformulate this architecture that you have the inhibitory and excitatory neurons. So basically, what Georg did, he just essentially splitted these nodes into excitatory nodes, inhibitory nodes, these nodes into excitatory nodes, inhibitory nodes, and essentially you can then, if you have two copies of them, you can create a network which will basically work like this, and follow the kind of constraints of excitation inhibition. And then another thing which I wanted to kind of answer to this is that, once you came up with this machine, and we kind of noticed, that this is just so simple and so beautiful, then we realized that actually this is not the only machine you can make. But there's like infinitely many other machines you can construct. So now we have the whole zoo of other networks which follow in the family of energy models, and we think that some of them correspond to biology more closely than the original Rand-Ballard predictive coding architecture, but importantly, they still follow very similar computational principles. So even though I personally now think that Rand-Ballard architecture is not exactly what the brain is doing, it's doing something very, very similar, probably using springs connected in a slightly different ways, which makes computation simpler.
Thank you. Very, very inspiring talk. So my question is about the scalability of these methods and the compute budget. Are they more budget friendly in terms of memory Usage and compute power. Yeah.
Okay, that's a really good question. So of course, I try to sell predictive coding networks during this talk and show you that they are more kind of sampling efficient. But in terms of actual computing time, if you implement it in a naive way, they are slower. And this is because each iteration involves not just weight modification, but you have to do this kind of relaxation until convergence. So yes, if you do them this way, they are slower. Now, a former student in Oxford, Tommaso Salvatore, came up with a very clever way of making them equally fast. So here's this very clever implementation which caches memory, caches some of these activities in memory, and he can show that this is equally fast as backprop in terms of computing time per number of iterations. So overall, it's faster. Unfortunately, this method is just so difficult to understand that no reviewers can understand it. So it's still not published. So if you get to review this paper, please try to be gentle to Tommaso, because I think it really works. It's just, it's very difficult to explain. I don't remember the details, so I will not even try to, but there's some kind of like a very clever way of caching these variables, which allows this equally fast implementation as backprop.
Is it available on GitHub?
That's a good question. So all the codes for this model on all our simulations, which I showed today, are available on GitHub. So you have to Google Yuhang Song. And I think, okay, so we hope that our paper, so we have still bioarchive preprint, but it's kind of in the very last stages, hopefully will be accepted very soon officially in Nature Neuroscience. So I think that now the editor asked us to write like a 25-character summary. So hopefully that's a good sign.
Hopefully a cover.
Yes, yes. So in the finally published version, there will be also a link in the manuscript. But if you just kind of Google on GitHub Yuhang Song, on his page, he has all the codes. The other paper is on by Tommaso Salvatore. It's on archive, and the title is Incremental Predictive Coding. So this is how Tommaso calls his super fast implementation. And I'm not sure whether he has codes on GitHub, but he's a very friendly person, so I'm sure that you can ask him for this. Okay, and the last thing which I wanted to say, that of course the constraint of speed are just the constraint of the kind of von Neumann digital architectures, right? So the biological neurons do not rely on von Neumann digital architectures. They are kind of analog devices. So we also think that if the dedicated hardware for predictive coding is developed, it has the potential to be much, much faster than existing hardware implementations of machine learning. Well, so you probably, so for example, so you might have heard about another closely related algorithm called equilibrium propagation, which is another kind of algorithm in the kind of family of energy-based models. And for example, people who developed equilibrium propagation, I think the lead author of this paper is now working for a neuromorphic hardware company which develops analog hardware, Rain Neuromorphic, I think. So basically, I think that just looking at what they have done, probably some kind of analog hardware would be most effective.
Any other questions?
Can I ask it? Yeah. It's probably a bit of a dumb one. It's to do with how to implement like batch learning. Do you know how the idea you gave at the start was that you pin the output neurons to the target? How does that work in terms of batch learning?
Okay, so first, in biology, you don't have batch learning, right? So this is a question which is not relevant for biology. Now, the super fast implementation of predictive coding by Tommaso relies on batch learning. So basically, you have to somehow cleverly cache activities during the whole batch. And unfortunately, I don't remember the details. It's terrible that this talk is being recorded. Hopefully, Tommaso will not see it. But you can look at the paper. It's a kind of like a very clever way of caching these different variables during batches. So it's kind of more memory intensive, but gives you the same kind of time performance.
Is it clear that there's no batch learning in real brains?
not to the extent it is in machine learning, right? So we have to, if I tell you, for example, I come from Poland and I tell you that hello in Poland is cześć. Hopefully you now remember this, right? So even after a single iteration, you remember this information.
Yeah, but I mean, if it's like adaptive, that's like some concepts
Yes. So there is, of course, brain is very sophisticated and has some kind of mechanism of learning taking place on multiple timescales. Right? So sometimes we know that, for example, information to be consolidated in memory, it will be more likely to be consolidated for a longer period if it's kind of repeated. Yes. So there are some kind of elements of learning over longer periods, which may be kind of similar to batch learning, but on the fundamental level, when you present an input to a neuron, the synaptic changes happen instantaneously or after a short delay.
I have one question about the, like, what is the some like observation or measurement which would like give more, let's say, evidence that this is close to what biology does, and what are the measurements which would, like, let's say, not falsify, but not say that this is not really everything?
Yes, so that's a great question. So I think that I skipped this part of the talk because this is kind of like a computer science a machine learning group. So I didn't think that you would be interested. The general audience will be interested in this. But in the paper we provide like examples of 3 different experiments where we can explain with prospective configuration learning better than with backprop. Yes, and essentially there is this general idea that in many tasks it has been proposed that when the feedback is provided, the brain infers a latent state of environment also from the feedback and only updates its parameters of the model based on this latent state. And there's like several studies which propose this in different domains of learning, motor learning, reinforcement learning, and essentially this kind of developed abstract Bayesian models to describe it, which didn't have kind of any neural implementation. And in our full paper, we showed that with very simple predictive coding networks, we can actually replicate all these observations. And this inference of the latent state of environment corresponds to basically the changes of activity of hidden neurons in these predictive coding networks. And yeah, after the talk, I'll be very happy to show you some of the examples of these tasks.
So I have another question about the future of computation. So do you think like one day we will have like a matrix of tiny soft tissue brains that do the computation faster than NVIDIA stations?
Well,
biological energy-based models.
No. Okay, so I actually think that it's rather that we will kind of come up with a engineering solution, so circuits, like electronic circuits, which actually operate on principles more similar to the brain. Because if you think about it, like the basic Hodgkin-Huxley model of the neuron, for which Nobel Prize was given, it's a capacitor, resistor, inductor circuit, right? So basically, all the kind of computations of the neurons can be easily captured in electronic circuits. It's just that these electronic circuits have to be kind of to achieve, for example, this kind of learning according to prospective configuration have to be done in a slightly different way than von Neumann computers. So I rather think that we'll go to the
staying
route
hard,
of,
not going soft, basically.
Yes.
Thank you.
Any other questions? All right, then let's give Rafal a big round of applause. Thank you so much for your talk. It's really good.
Thank you.
And I think you can stay around for a couple of minutes if anybody does want to ask any direct questions. Please do grab some coffee at the back. And yeah, we'll talk from there.